My wife called me while I was in Zurich, closing a deal I'd worked on for 9 months. I remember the time exactly, 2:14 a.m. Her time, 8:14 p.m. Mine. I thought it was an emergency. I was wrong. She sounded cheerful, almost rehearsed. "I'm divorcing you," she said, "and I've already sold our beach house. I'm moving in with my trainer." She laughed, like she was announcing a promotion, not detonating a marriage. I kept my voice steady. "I understand," I said, and she hung up without another word. I stood by the hotel window, watching planes cut across the night sky, and realized something important. She thought she'd caught me off guard. She hadn't. My name is Michael Turner, 44 years old, senior project manager for a logistics firm out of Boston. 15 years married to Emily, yoga instructor, part-time wellness blogger, full-time chaser of whatever new phase promised happiness. The beach house she'd sold? It was in my name only, something she'd never bothered to notice. The trainer she'd left me for? I'd met him once. Blonde, loud, barely 30. The kind of man who believed confidence was a substitute for character. When she called, I didn't yell, didn't beg. I opened my laptop, logged into our joint accounts, and started checking transactions. The sale hadn't gone through the usual escrow service. She'd used a private buyer, quick cash deal. That told me two things: she'd been planning this, and she was hiding something. I booked an early flight home, but before boarding, I called my attorney, Grace Coleman. She'd handled my business contracts for years. "Grace," I said, "I think my wife just committed fraud." Grace paused. "Tell me everything," she said. By the time I landed in Boston, she'd already confirmed what I suspected. The sale paperwork listed both our names, but the signature under mine wasn't mine. It was close, though. Close enough that she must have practiced. When I got home that weekend, I didn't storm in or make a scene. I just walked through the house, room by room, noting what was gone. Her clothes, the art I bought her in San Francisco, my watch collection. Even the safe in my office was missing, empty space on the carpet where it used to sit. She'd been methodical, but so had I. What she didn't know was that I'd changed the title on the beach house months ago, after a conversation with my accountant. "Always protect your assets," he'd said. "Love doesn't void paperwork." The sale she bragged about, legally worthless. Emily smiled when I finally saw her. That fake, smug smile she used when she thought she'd won. It disappeared the second I laid the documents on the table between us. Her smile quickly faded. Emily didn't expect me to be calm. She expected rage, begging, chaos, something she could call toxic when she told her version of the story. Instead, I stood there, silent, while she flipped through the documents. I watched the color drain from her face as she realized the beach house wasn't hers to sell. She tried to recover, said there must be a mistake, that I'd misfiled the deed. I didn't respond. Silence unsettled her more than any accusation could. When she finally stopped talking, I said only one thing: "You forged my signature. That's a felony." She stammered something about love, about needing to move on, about how we'd both be happier apart. I nodded once and walked out. That was the last time I saw her in our home. But that was also the moment I understood something deeper. She wasn't just trying to leave. She was trying to erase me. I went back to my car, sat for a long time, and let the anger settle into something colder, sharper. Years of business taught me that emotion clouds judgment, but patience wins wars. I wasn't going to fight Emily in the open. I was going to dismantle her quietly. Over the next few days, I gathered everything: bank statements, property transfers, text records, emails from real estate agents. Grace, my lawyer, helped me file an immediate injunction on the fraudulent sale. The court froze the transaction before the funds could transfer. The buyer would get their money back. Emily would get nothing. Grace called it poetic justice. I called it phase 1. By Thursday, Emily's trainer had already started posting photos with her. Cocktails, sunsets, new beginnings. I didn't react. I simply sent Grace another message: "Start tracing where she's been moving money." Within hours, we found small transfers from our joint account to an unknown one under her maiden name. She was preparing her exit months before she called me. But the real discovery came when Grace noticed a name on the beach house paperwork: Daniel Price. The same trainer. He wasn't just her boyfriend. He was listed as a co-investor, meaning they tried to sell my property as a joint venture. That wasn't stupidity. That was conspiracy. That night, I sat in the dark of my office, staring at the empty space where the safe used to be. I thought about every lie she'd told, every laugh she'd faked, every time she'd said we were fine. Then I opened my notebook and wrote 3 words: freeze, track, respond. The plan had officially begun. I spent that weekend not reacting, but organizing. The house felt hollow, stripped of warmth, but it was still mine, legally and otherwise. I walked through each room taking photos, documenting what was missing. Jewelry boxes, electronics, artwork, all insured. She'd taken what she thought mattered. She hadn't realized I'd already insured, inventoried, and traced every high-value item months earlier. I'd learned long ago that security isn't about expecting betrayal. It's about preparing for it. Monday morning, I visited the bank. The manager, who'd known me for years, confirmed Emily had withdrawn the last of our joint savings 2 days before her call. Nearly $40,000. It was petty theft compared to the property fraud, but still useful leverage. Grace told me not to contact Emily directly. I told her I wouldn't. I didn't need to. That night, I logged into the cloud account synced to the cameras at the beach house. Emily had never changed the access codes. She probably thought selling the property erased my digital footprint. The feed showed the date of the supposed sale. Emily and her trainer were inside, celebrating with champagne. Boxes everywhere. A for sale sign still in the yard. She was laughing. He was recording her on his phone. It would have been just another clip of self-delusion, except for one thing. A detail she overlooked. In the corner of the frame, on the table, sat the contract folder I'd left in that house months ago, complete with the real deed, notarized and sealed. Meaning, she had forged an entirely different version for her sale. I smiled. That single frame was proof of intent. The next day, Grace filed additional claims: fraud, misrepresentation, theft of insured property, and unauthorized use of assets. Quietly, efficiently. While Emily was busy posting photos of her new life, her accounts were being frozen one by one. The calls started coming in to her lawyer by Friday. She must have realized something was wrong when her debit card stopped working. I didn't respond when she tried calling me again. I had nothing left to say. I wasn't going to fight for closure. I was going to let the silence do the work. By the end of that week, I wasn't the man she'd humiliated on that overseas call. I was the man standing behind every system she thought she could manipulate, the quiet one she underestimated. And she was about to learn that silence has consequences. By the time Emily realized what was happening, it was already too late. Grace forwarded me an email her lawyer had sent, panicked, full of legal jargon and desperate requests for clarification about the property injunction. Emily had probably sat across from him in that expensive office, pretending to be confident while watching her entire plan collapse in real time. I could almost hear her voice, the nervous laughter she used when control started slipping. She thought I'd be emotional. Instead, I was methodical. I spent those days moving like a shadow through my own life. Work didn't know what was happening. Friends didn't suspect anything. To them, I was just a man who'd returned from a business trip. But underneath the surface, every move was calculated. Grace was securing financial protections. I was reviewing surveillance. And Emily, well, Emily was unraveling. On Wednesday, the police contacted her. Grace had filed a criminal complaint over the forged signature and unauthorized sale attempt. It wasn't about sending her to prison. Not yet. It was about pressure. People like Emily panic under pressure. They confess without realizing they're confessing. 2 days later, I received a delivery at my office. A plain envelope, no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from Emily. She said she never meant for things to go this far. She said Daniel had convinced her to handle the sale quickly, that he'd take care of the paperwork. She even implied I'd forced her hand by being too distant, too focused on work. The usual script. It wasn't an apology. It was damage control. Grace told me to keep it. Evidence of intent, motive, and manipulation. Every sentence was a nail in her own coffin. But what caught my attention wasn't the excuses. It was a small detail: Daniel's last name. Price. Grace found it in public records. Daniel Price had filed for bankruptcy 2 years ago and had a pending fraud charge that somehow vanished after a settlement. Meaning, my wife wasn't just reckless. She was sleeping next to a professional con artist. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed in my office, staring at the city lights reflecting off the glass. Emily had chosen her partner well, but she'd made one fatal mistake. She underestimated mine. Because I wasn't just her husband anymore. I was the man building a case, one she'd never see coming. I began tracing Daniel Price the same way I would track a corporate competitor, quietly, through data and habits. Grace gave me access to a private investigator she trusted, someone who specialized in financial crimes. His name was Harris, ex-FBI. Straightforward. No small talk. Within 48 hours, he'd compiled a file that made my skin crawl. Daniel had been involved in 3 prior relationships that all followed the same pattern. Each woman was financially stable, property-owning, and recently separated. Each relationship ended with assets missing and police reports lost in the system. He knew how to exploit trust like a business model. What stood out most wasn't what Daniel stole, but how he disappeared. Every time, he'd leave just before legal trouble surfaced. He never faced charges directly. Someone else always took the fall. Emily wasn't his first mark, but she might be his last. Harris's report also included something else. Photos. Daniel meeting with a man outside a luxury gym downtown. The man was a realtor, one I recognized. He'd handled the fraudulent beach house listing. That meant Daniel wasn't just using Emily emotionally. He was running her as part of a real scheme. A partnership built on deceit, forged signatures, and cash deals. I printed everything, arranged it in a single folder, and slid it across Grace's desk the next morning. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she nodded once and said, "This isn't a divorce anymore. It's organized fraud." From that point, we stopped reacting and started maneuvering. Grace contacted law enforcement quietly, giving them the evidence without my name attached. The less attention I drew, the better. Meanwhile, I began documenting my own timeline: emails, bank alerts, camera footage, insurance claims. Every date mattered. Every small inconsistency in Emily's story would eventually turn into leverage. By the weekend, the investigation had already begun. Daniel's name triggered old records. Emily's transaction flagged for review. I knew it was only a matter of time before she realized the walls were closing in. Late Sunday night, she texted me again. Just 5 words. "We need to talk, Michael." I stared at the message for a while before turning off my phone. There was nothing to say. I wasn't her husband anymore. I was the ghost in the system she'd tried to erase. Watching, collecting, waiting. And she was about to learn what happens when a quiet man stops forgiving. By Monday morning, Emily's world was starting to shrink. The bank had frozen her remaining accounts, the sale funds were locked, and her new boyfriend's record was surfacing in every system that mattered. Grace called to update me. The authorities were officially reviewing the forged documents. That meant subpoenas were next. Emily wouldn't know until they showed up at her door. Grace told me to keep my distance. I told her I planned to. But distance doesn't mean disengagement. It means control. That evening, I drove to the coast. The beach house stood exactly as I'd left it. Empty, silent, mine again. The ocean was calm, the sky a dull gray. For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. I walked through the rooms, checked the cameras, the locks, the documents still in the safe. Every detail mattered. When people think you're emotional, they underestimate how patient you can be. On my way out, I noticed a black SUV parked 2 houses down. I didn't recognize it. The engine was off, but I could feel someone inside watching. I didn't stop or stare. I just noted the license plate and kept driving. By the time I got home, Harris had already confirmed it was registered to Daniel Price. He was tailing me now, which meant Emily was losing her grip. That night, I wrote everything down in my notebook. Every date, every name, every encounter. Patterns always reveal intent. Emily wasn't acting alone anymore. She was desperate, probably scared of what Daniel might do once the money froze. That kind of fear makes people reckless. And reckless people talk. 2 days later, Grace forwarded me an update from the investigators. The forged sale wasn't an isolated attempt. Daniel and the realtor had pulled off 3 similar deals in other states. Same pattern: woman, divorce, fake paperwork, fast cash. They just never met someone who kept better records than they did. Emily called again that night. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice cracked this time. She said things were getting out of control, that she'd made a mistake, that she just wanted to talk. I listened to the message once, saved it, and forwarded it to Grace. Because now it wasn't just betrayal. It was evidence. And the only thing stronger than revenge is proof. By the end of that week, the silence became my weapon. I didn't respond to her messages, didn't acknowledge her lawyer's attempts to settle privately. The less I said, the louder the truth became. Grace's updates came daily now. Investigators had connected Daniel and the realtor to a string of fraudulent real estate deals across 3 states. Emily's name appeared in 2 of them, listed as joint owner or seller of record. Whether she knew the full extent didn't matter. On paper, she was part of a criminal operation. The next morning, Harris called. He'd picked up chatter that Daniel was getting nervous. His associates were disappearing, and he'd been trying to liquidate assets under new aliases. I knew what that meant. Daniel would turn on Emily the moment the pressure hit. That was fine. She'd chosen her team. That night, I watched the beach house cameras again. The live feed showed movement. Emily was there. She paced through the living room, phone pressed to her ear, voice sharp and panicked. She thought I couldn't hear her, but I could. The cameras recorded everything. She shouted Daniel's name, said something about the FBI and the bank freezing everything. Then she threw the phone across the room. For a moment, she just stood there, staring out the window like she could still see the life she'd traded me for. Grace called early the next day. The FBI had formally opened the case. She told me to be ready for interviews. I didn't feel vindicated, not yet. I just felt still, like the moment before a storm hits. That afternoon, Daniel finally made his move. He showed up at my office. Security called before he reached the front desk. He was agitated, demanding to see me. I told them to let him wait in the lobby. Cameras rolling. 10 minutes later, he stormed out, shouting that he'd fix this himself. The footage captured everything. His face, his tone, his threat. Grace reviewed it that evening. She said it was more valuable than I realized. Intent to intimidate, she called it. Another piece of the puzzle. I poured myself a drink and stared out the window. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just waited. Because soon, everything they'd built on lies was going to collapse under its own weight. And I didn't need to lift a finger to make it happen. The morning after Daniel's outburst, I woke to a voicemail from Grace. Her voice was calm, almost careful. The FBI had moved faster than expected. They'd executed warrants on Daniel's business accounts and seized digital records linking him to multiple fraudulent property sales, including the attempted one on my beach house. Emily's name appeared throughout the files. Grace warned me she'd likely reach out again, maybe even try to play the victim. Stay quiet, she said. Let the evidence speak. By noon, my phone started buzzing nonstop. Unknown numbers, blocked calls, one from her old attorney. I didn't answer any of them. Then, finally, a text came through from Emily herself. It was short. She said she'd made a mistake, that she hadn't known what Daniel was doing, that she was scared. She asked to meet just to talk. I read it twice, then set my phone face down. There was no reason to meet. She was already talking to the people who mattered. That evening, Harris called. His voice carried the edge of something between triumph and exhaustion. Daniel had been arrested at a storage unit outside Portland. Inside, they'd found forged deeds, fake IDs, and a thumb drive with transaction logs connecting every part of the operation. The FBI had what they needed. Emily hadn't been arrested yet, but she was being questioned. Grace said the agents wanted my full statement the next morning. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with my notes spread out, every document, every timestamp, every screenshot from the cameras. I remembered how it all started, her laughing on the phone, telling me she'd sold our beach house. And I thought about how easily people confuse kindness for weakness. When I arrived at the field office the next day, the agents were already waiting. They asked methodical questions. How long I'd known about the forgery, when I'd noticed the missing funds, whether I'd confronted her directly. I told them the truth. I hadn't needed to. The paper trail told the story for me. When the interview ended, one of the agents said something that stuck with me. He said, "You were patient. Most people lash out. You planned." I nodded once. Because patience isn't passive. It's the quiet part of power. And she was about to learn just how loud silence can become when it finally speaks. 2 weeks later, the storm finally broke. News outlets started running quiet blurbs about a multi-state real estate fraud investigation. No names at first, just details. Fake property sales, forged documents, high-value assets. but I knew who they were talking about. Grace called that morning, her tone lighter than I'd ever heard it. The FBI had formally charged Daniel and the realtor with conspiracy and wire fraud. Emily wasn't named as a primary defendant, but she was listed as a cooperating witness. That meant she'd turned. Grace said Emily had given a full statement, admitting she'd forged my signature under Daniel's instruction. She claimed she'd done it out of fear and manipulation. It wasn't hard to predict. When people like her lose control, they rebrand themselves as victims. Grace told me not to comment publicly, not to engage if contacted by reporters. I told her I wouldn't. My part was over. That night, I sat on the porch with a drink, watching the wind move through the trees. I thought about how small choices accumulate over years. How the things you ignore, small lies, cold silences, become patterns you learn to live with. Emily had crossed that line long before she made the call from my hotel room. That night in Zurich wasn't the beginning. It was just the moment I stopped pretending not to see it. A week later, I got an unexpected letter. It wasn't from the court or the FBI. It was from Emily, written by hand, no return address. She said she was sorry for how things turned out. She said she'd lost everything, and that she hoped one day I could forgive her. She wrote that Daniel had used her, that she'd learned her lesson. I didn't finish reading it. I folded it once and dropped it in the fireplace. Grace called again a few days later. The FBI had concluded the investigation. The fraudulent funds were being recovered, and since I'd cooperated early, I'd be receiving restitution. Daniel had accepted a plea deal, 8 years. The realtor got 10. Grace paused before hanging up. She said, "You handled this better than most." I told her it wasn't about handling. It was about ending things correctly, with precision, with silence. And as the fire burned low that night, I realized something simple. Revenge is loud, but justice whispers. And I'd learned to listen. 6 months passed before I saw her again. The courthouse lobby was quiet that morning, just the echo of footsteps on marble and the hum of vending machines in the hallway. I'd come to sign the final papers. The divorce decree, property settlement, and restitution release were all ready. Grace handled most of it, but my signature was still required. When I looked up from the documents, Emily was standing across the room. She looked smaller than I remembered, the confidence drained out of her posture. She didn't approach. She just stared, waiting for me to say something. I didn't. Her attorney handled everything. Grace slid the last folder across the table, and that was it. 13 years of marriage, finalized in less than 20 minutes. When it ended, Emily tried to speak, but Grace stepped in, professional as ever, and said we were done. We walked out first. Outside, the air felt clearer than it had in months. For the first time, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even relieved. I was just finished. Grace said she'd call later with confirmation of the wire transfer for restitution. Then she shook my hand and left. I stayed by the courthouse steps, watching people move through their ordinary lives. No one knew what had happened. No one saw the war that had played out behind closed doors. And that was how I wanted it. That evening, I drove to the coast again. The beach house was still there, still mine, still quiet. I walked along the shoreline until the light started fading. The tide had carried away the footprints from my last visit, just like everything else I'd left behind. The ocean doesn't hold grudges. It just erases and moves on. I sat on the deck and watched the horizon. Somewhere out there, Emily was rebuilding her story. Maybe she'd tell people I was cold, unfeeling. Maybe she'd even believe it herself. That didn't matter. I wasn't defined by her lies anymore. When the sun finally disappeared, I locked the door behind me and headed back to the car. The house stood solid in the fading light, clean, empty, unbroken. I realized I didn't need revenge or closure or forgiveness. I already had what mattered most: my name, my peace, and the kind of silence that speaks for itself. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.